Before we begin, tell me in your heart where you are watching from tonight and what hour it is in your corner of the world as you step into this story. Margaret Bell used to believe that grief had a sound. Not the dramatic kind people imagined in films, not the sobbing collapse at the foot of a hospital bed, not the scream that echoed through a chapel after a coffin was lowered into the ground. No, the true sound of grief, she learned, was much quieter than that. It was the hum of an old refrigerator in a nearly empty kitchen. It was the ticking of a second-hand clock at 2 in the morning while bills sat unpaid on the table. It was the soft cough of a child sleeping in the next room, unaware that her entire world had changed in a single week. She was 32 when her husband died. David Bell had not been rich, nor powerful, nor connected. He had been a ferry mechanic in a small coastal town in the south of England, a good man with capable hands and a laugh that made strangers turn their heads. He could repair almost anything with patience and a wrench, and he had this stubborn habit of making promises as though life would always leave enough time to keep them. "We'll take Elena to Italy one day," he had once said, while scrubbing grease from his fingers at the sink. "She should see old cities, old churches, real stone streets." Margaret had smiled while drying plates. "She's 6, David. Right now she's impressed by puddles and biscuits." "That's why I said one day," he replied, grinning. "And one day I'm buying you that flower shop, too." It was one of 1,000 impossible, beautiful promises made by people who had no idea how quickly ordinary life could break. After he died from a sudden stroke on a cold November morning, Margaret did not have the luxury of collapsing. There was paperwork to fill out. There was a funeral to arrange with money they did not really have. There was a child named Elena who stood in the hallway holding a stuffed rabbit and asking in a frightened whisper, "When is Daddy coming home?" Margaret remembered kneeling in front of her daughter and touching her face. Elena's cheeks were still round then, her eyes still open in the innocent way children look at adults when they believe every answer will make sense. "Daddy isn't coming home, sweetheart," Margaret had said, her voice so calm she later frightened herself with it. Elena blinked. "Because he's in heaven?" Margaret swallowed hard. "Yes." "Will heaven give him his toolbox?" That question nearly shattered her. Instead of crying, she pulled the girl close and held her until Elena wriggled from the tightness of the embrace and asked if she could still wear the red dress for school pictures next week. Children moved differently through pain. They stepped around it because they had no choice. Margaret envied that. In the months that followed, she learned how expensive widowhood really was. Not in the obvious ways alone, though those were brutal enough. The mortgage did not pause out of sympathy. The school fees did not disappear because a father had been buried. The radiator still broke. Elena still outgrew her shoes. The world had the nerve to continue sending invoices as if no tragedy had occurred. At first, Margaret worked wherever anyone would have her. In the mornings, she cleaned rooms at the old seafront hotel where tourists came in summer and pensioners came in the off-season for discounted tea packages. In the afternoons, she helped a bakery wrap pastries and scrub trays. At night, twice a week, she covered the reception desk at a motor lodge off the bypass, where drunk businessmen mistook her politeness for invitation and rang the bell too hard when they wanted fresh towels. By the second year, exhaustion had become a permanent state of being. One winter evening, her friend June found her asleep at the kitchen table with an overdue electric bill stuck to her cheek. "Margaret," June touched her shoulder gently, "you cannot keep doing this." Margaret sat up, disoriented. "Did I miss the school run? It's 7 in the evening." Margaret pressed her fingers to her forehead. "I was only closing my eyes for a second." June looked around at the narrow kitchen, the chipped paint, the careful little stack of coins near the kettle. "You need help." Margaret gave a tired smile. "Unless help is bringing me a dead husband and a paid-off house, I think we'll have to make do with tea." But even in the hardest seasons, she had rules. Elena would not know how desperate things truly were. Elena would stay in her school. Elena would have warm meals, proper books, and music lessons, because David had once said their daughter had a good ear when she hummed along to the radio, and Margaret clung to that comment like it was an inheritance. So she began selling pieces of her old life. First went the gold bracelet David had saved up for on their 10th anniversary, then a pair of earrings from her mother. Then, months later, her wedding ring itself, though she took it off only after sitting with it in her palm for nearly an hour, unable to decide whether survival counted as betrayal. The pawnbroker barely looked at her. "Gold prices are decent this month," he muttered, weighing it. Margaret stared at the counter so she would not have to watch the ring leave her hand. "It was my husband's." He nodded as if that meant nothing at all. "Most things are someone's." With that money, she paid for Elena's term at the private girls' school where her scholarship covered only part of the cost. She bought the violin Elena's teacher said would help discipline her talent. She paid for the train pass when Elena was old enough to attend weekend tutoring in the city. She smiled through every school event in dresses bought second-hand and altered by hand so neatly no one would notice the seams. When Elena was 10, she came home from school flushed with excitement and announced, "Mom, Clara's mother says I speak like I could be on television." Margaret laughed while stirring soup. "That sounds very grand." Elena twirled in the kitchen. "She says I don't sound like I'm from here." There was no malice in the child's voice, only pride. Margaret looked at her daughter's bright face and said softly, "You can be from anywhere you want, as long as you remember where you started." Elena nodded, without truly listening. She was too young yet to understand that ambition and gratitude often begin as neighbors, but do not always remain friends. By the time Elena turned 13, Margaret had moved on from cleaning jobs into something steadier. She took a full-time position as a night receptionist at the Beaumont House Hotel, a modest Victorian property overlooking the water. The hours were cruel, but the lobby had flowers, and the flowers did something to her. Every week she found herself straightening arrangements after guests brushed past them. She learned which stems lasted longest, which colors comforted people, which blooms made a tired room feel expensive. One evening, the hotel owner, Mrs. Trowbridge, noticed Margaret replacing wilted carnations with fresher stems from a delivery crate. "You've done that rather beautifully," the older woman said. Margaret nearly dropped the vase. "I'm sorry, I should have asked." Mrs. Trowbridge stepped closer. "No, I'm glad you didn't. The arrangement looked like a funeral waiting room before." That was how it started. At first, she was simply allowed to tidy the flowers. Then she was asked to suggest table arrangements for a small luncheon. Then a local church hired her for a christening after seeing the display in the hotel dining room. Margaret worked these little floral jobs in the hours between shifts and school runs, her hands rough from bleach, but increasingly skilled with ribbon, wire, and stems. Elena, now 14 and more observant than before, watched her mother one Saturday night while she sat at the dining table surrounded by hydrangeas and cream roses. "Mom, you look different when you do flowers." Margaret smiled without looking up. "Different how?" "Not tired." That nearly undid her more than any hardship had. By 16, Elena had grown strikingly poised. She had David's dark hair, Margaret's eyes, and a posture taught by years of wanting to belong in rooms more polished than the one she came from. Teachers praised her intelligence. Other mothers praised her manners. People liked saying she was going places, and each time Margaret heard it, pride and fear rose together in her chest. Because she could already see it, the widening of Elena's world and the shrinking of Margaret's place inside it. Still, she pushed forward. She borrowed carefully, saved obsessively, and eventually rented a tiny storefront on a side street not far from the harbor. It had peeling paint, one crooked window, and barely enough room for a counter, a cooler, and 2 display buckets. But when she turned the sign to open for the first time, she felt something in herself stand up again after years of kneeling before necessity. Belle and Bloom. That was the name she chose, because David had once promised her a flower shop, and she wanted their daughter to see that some promises could survive, even if the people who made them did not. On opening day, Elena came in wearing her school blazer and looked around the shop with shining eyes. "Mom," she said, almost breathless, "this looks like one of those little stores in films." Margaret laughed. "Let's hope it earns more than one." Elena ran her fingers lightly over the counter. "When I'm older, I'm going to make sure you never have to worry about money again." Margaret looked at her daughter then, really looked at her, at the certainty in her young face, at the tenderness still living there before the world could sand it down into something harder. "You don't owe me your life, Elena," she said quietly. Elena frowned as though the idea were ridiculous. "Maybe not, but I still want to give you a better one." Margaret reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "Then just live well. That will be enough." At that time, she still believed it. She believed that sacrifice, if made in love, would naturally return as love. She believed that children who were carried through storms would remember the arms that held them dry. She believed that the years of hunger, debt, humiliation, and endurance were building toward something noble, toward a future where Elena would rise and Margaret would finally rest. And in many ways, life did improve. The shop grew slowly. A local wedding planner began using her for small events. The Beaumont House commissioned her for all seasonal arrangements. There were still lean months and frightening bills, but there was also dignity now, and purpose, and a name over the door that belonged to her. What Margaret could not yet see, standing in that little shop with dirt under her nails and hope in her chest, was that success would not only lift her daughter into brighter rooms, it would also teach Elena how much easier it was to be admired when no one could see the cost of how she got there. By the time Elena Bell turned 26, she no longer looked like a girl from a windy seaside town whose mother still rose before dawn to unload flower buckets in the cold. She looked like the sort of woman magazines liked to describe with words such as polished, accomplished, and effortlessly elegant. Her clothes were tailored. Her speech had softened into something cleaner and more careful than the clipped rhythms of her childhood. Even the way she entered a room had changed. Margaret noticed it the first time Elena came home from London after her second year at university. She paused at the doorway as if measuring the space, as if deciding how much of herself belonged in it now. At first, Margaret told herself that such changes were natural. A scholarship to a prestigious university opened doors that neither she nor David had ever imagined. Elena had moved through those doors with the sharp intelligence Margaret had spent years protecting. She studied communications, then event branding, and then somehow found her way into an internship at a boutique luxury agency that handled gallery launches, private dinners, and charity events for wealthy clients who considered understatement the ultimate proof of status. "It's all image," Elena had explained one Christmas while helping set the table. "Not in a fake way, more like curating what people feel." Margaret smiled as she set down roast potatoes. "That sounds like a polite way of saying rich people pay you to make them look effortless." Elena had laughed. "You're not wrong." Those were still easy years, or at least easier than what came later. Elena came home less often, but she still called. She still asked how the shop was doing. She still thanked Margaret when a train fare or rent shortfall was quietly covered by money Elena pretended not to need, but clearly did. Margaret did not resent it. She never would have called the help a burden. If anything, she felt proud that her daughter lived in a city where opportunity was expensive enough to be worth fighting for. Then Elena met Adrian Whitmore. Margaret first heard his name in an ordinary way, over the phone on a Tuesday evening while she was trimming lilies after closing Belle and Bloom. "He's kind," Elena said, a little too casually. Properly kind, not performative. Margaret tucked the receiver between her shoulder and ear. That already puts him above half the men in Britain. Elena laughed. He works in property development, but don't make that face. I didn't make a face. Mum, I can hear your face. Margaret smiled to herself. All right. And is he serious? There was a pause. One of those soft pauses that carried more truth than an immediate answer. Yes, Elena said quietly. I think he might be. When Margaret finally met Adrian several months later, she understood at once why her daughter had fallen for him. He was handsome, in a restrained way, with thoughtful eyes and manners that felt genuine rather than rehearsed. He listened when people spoke. He remembered details. He did not dominate conversation, which, in Margaret's experience, was rarer in well-bred men than newspapers liked to admit. He brought wine for dinner, complimented Margaret's roast chicken without sounding patronizing, and when he saw the wall of family photos in the hallway, he stopped long enough to study them. That one's my father, Elena said, pointing to a faded picture of David in work clothes, one arm around a grinning 6-year-old Elena by the harbor. Adrian nodded. You look like him around the eyes. Margaret felt a strange, quick warmth toward him then. Later that night, while washing dishes, she said softly to Elena, He's a good man. Elena, drying plates beside her, lowered her voice. His family is a bit more complicated. Margaret glanced over. Complicated how? They're old-fashioned, very image-conscious, very private. Margaret snorted lightly. That usually means judgmental with better furniture. Mum! What? It's true. Elena placed a plate in the rack. I just mean they care about presentation, about background, about how things look from the outside. Margaret was quiet a moment. And what have they been told about yours? Elena did not answer straight away. She folded the dish towel once, then again. Nothing untrue, which was not the same thing as saying everything true. Margaret noticed the sentence, stored it away, and told herself not to make too much of it. But over the following year, details began collecting like rainwater in cracks. There was the first dinner invitation to Adrian's parents' London townhouse, to which Elena insisted Margaret need not come because it's not really that kind of evening. There was the engagement party, where Elena introduced her to several guests so quickly and vaguely that Margaret was not entirely sure who believed she was a family friend, who assumed she was a relative, and who had not noticed her at all. There was the time Margaret phoned while Elena was with Adrian's mother, Vivian Whitmore, and Elena answered in a stiff, overly formal tone, calling her back 2 hours later with unnecessary brightness. You sounded different earlier, Margaret said. I was just busy. With whom? Elaborate people. Margaret had let out a dry little laugh. Should I be offended? No, of course not. But something in Elena's voice had already shifted into that careful register Margaret had started hearing more often, as if every conversation were being balanced on a tray that must not tip. Vivian Whitmore entered Margaret's life gradually, mostly through second-hand descriptions and later through brief, polished interactions that somehow left a chill behind them. She was elegant, composed, and perfectly civil. Margaret could never point to a single openly rude thing the woman said. That was what made her unsettling. Vivian had mastered the art of exclusion through refinement. At a bridal luncheon 6 months before the wedding, Margaret arrived carrying a hand-tied arrangement of pale roses and eucalyptus for the hostess, only to have Vivian smile at Margaret and say, "How lovely! You're clearly very gifted with your hands." It sounded complimentary. It was not. Margaret smiled back. They've had to earn their keep. Vivian's expression did not shift. Yes, I imagine they have. Another time, while discussing possible floral concepts for the wedding, Vivian turned to the planner rather than Margaret and said, "We do want the event to feel elevated. Sentimental touches are charming, of course, but not if they pull us into anything too provincial." Elena had pretended not to hear it. Margaret heard everything. Still, she said nothing, not because she failed to understand, but because she had spent too many years choosing the battle that preserved the most peace. Elena was engaged. She was happy, at least on the surface, and Margaret had promised herself long ago that her daughter would not be made to carry her mother's pride like a weapon into every room. So when the wedding planning began in earnest, Margaret helped. At first, Elena protested weakly, "Mum, you've already done enough." Margaret, sitting across from her at a cafe in London, slid a folder of figures across the table. "I have savings. The shop has had 3 good seasons, and I am not letting my only daughter start married life beneath a mountain of debt for the sake of a string quartet." Elena gave a strained laugh. "It's not just a quartet."
"I know it's not. It's the venue, the catering, the dress alterations, the photographer, the welcome dinner, the transport, and whatever absurd amount people now spend on chairs." Elena's cheeks colored. Adrian's parents are contributing too, but not enough for the kind of wedding being discussed. Elena stared at the folder, then at her mother. "You shouldn't have had to save for something like this." Margaret reached for her teacup. "I didn't save for this, exactly. I saved because life taught me to. This just happens to be what it's becoming." That was only part of the truth. To make it work, Margaret did more than dip into savings. She refinanced the shop's small business loan under worse terms than she admitted. She sold the cottage she had nearly paid off and moved temporarily into a rented flat above a pharmacy, telling Elena she wanted less maintenance. She took on 3 additional hotel contracts through Bell & Bloom and worked so many hours her shoulders ached deep into the night. Yet, when Elena asked, "Are you sure?" Margaret always answered the same way, "Yes." Not because the cost was easy, but because mothers like her did not know how to do love halfway. The wedding Elena chose was an estate in the countryside, all old stone, clipped hedges, and expensive calm. It looked like the kind of place where people said things like summering rather than going away. Margaret visited it twice with the planner and once alone. Standing in the empty reception hall under chandeliers that resembled frozen rain, she tried to imagine Elena in white walking through the arched doorway. For a moment, the image was so beautiful it hurt. "She'll remember this forever," the planner said. Margaret nodded. "That's the idea." But as the wedding drew closer, Elena's nerves changed shape. She was not simply the ordinary anxious bride worried about weather, seating charts, or lipstick shades. Her tension sharpened whenever background was mentioned, whenever old stories surfaced, whenever someone from Adrian's side asked about family history in a tone too light to be innocent. At the rehearsal dinner, Margaret arrived in a navy dress she had bought months earlier and altered herself by hand. She wore her hair neatly pinned, and the pearl studs David had once given her on credit from a jeweler who trusted promises more than bank balances. She had rehearsed being warm, modest, invisible where needed. The planner, who had met her 3 times already, mistook her for someone from the floral staff and handed her a box of taper candles. Margaret almost laughed. Before she could answer, Elena swooped in too quickly. "She's with me," Elena said. The planner blinked. "Oh, of course, I'm so sorry." Margaret handed back the box with a calm smile. "No harm done." But later, while guests gathered under soft lights and waiters carried trays of champagne, Elena introduced her to one of Adrian's older aunts with the words, "This is Margaret. She's been such a help." Such a help. Not my mother, not the woman who raised me, not even simply, "This is my mom." Margaret felt the sentence land somewhere behind her ribs. That night, back in her hotel room, she stood at the sink removing her makeup and stared at her own reflection for a long time. The face looking back at her was still attractive in a strong, weathered way, but it was no longer young. It was the face of a woman who had carried crates, debts, disappointments, and devotion for years without putting any of them down. She heard David's voice in memory then, playful and certain from some vanished evening in their old kitchen. "She'll always be your girl." Margaret gripped the edge of the sink.
Yes, she whispered to the empty room. But will she always let me be her mother? She did not sleep much. On the morning of the wedding, the estate was alive before sunrise. Hairdressers drifted through corridors with curling irons and garment bags. Florists, not from Bell and Bloom this time because Elena had insisted on using a luxury wedding design firm for consistency, hurried in and out with boxes of imported blooms. Bridesmaids moved like perfume ads in matching robes, carrying coffee cups and secrets. Margaret arrived early carrying a small velvet box in her handbag. Inside was a brooch that belonged to her own mother, modest but beautiful, shaped like a spray of silver leaves with tiny seed pearls. She had polished it the night before. It was meant to be Elena's something old. She found her daughter in a private dressing room flooded with pale morning light. Her hair pinned in soft waves, her face composed into bridal perfection. For a one aching second, Margaret saw not the woman before her, but the child in the red dress, asking whether heaven would give her father his toolbox. "You look beautiful,"
Margaret said. Elena turned, smiling too quickly. "Mum, you're early." "I thought that was the point of weddings." Margaret reached into her bag. "I brought—" "Elena," one of the bridesmaids called from the adjoining room, "Vivian wants to confirm the family entrance order." At that, something flickered across Elena's face. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Mum, before they come in, there's something I need to ask." Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the velvet box. Elena's smile remained, but it was no longer a daughter's smile. It was the strained, polished smile of someone trying to keep a fragile illusion from cracking. And in that fragile, glittering room, with the wedding only moments away, Margaret felt the air change. Elena's smile trembled, though anyone passing the doorway might have mistaken it for bridal nerves. "Mum," she said softly, almost sweetly, "please don't take this the wrong way." Margaret stood very still. Years of hardship had trained her body to recognize danger before words fully arrived. Sometimes disaster announced itself with a slammed door, sometimes with a hospital call in the dark, and sometimes with a daughter lowering her voice before saying something she had already decided was necessary. "I'll try," Margaret replied. Elena glanced toward the half-open door and stepped closer. The scent of perfume, hairspray, and expensive flowers crowded the room. Somewhere down the corridor, glasses clinked, and women laughed too loudly in that brittle, pre-ceremony way people did when nerves had to be disguised as excitement. "It's just for today," Elena whispered. "Please don't tell them you're my mother." For a second, Margaret thought she must have misheard. The velvet box in her hand suddenly seemed heavy. "What?" Elena swallowed. "Please, I know how awful it sounds." "Then why say it?" "Because if this becomes complicated now, everything will fall apart." Margaret stared at her daughter's face, searching for a sign of shame strong enough to stop the sentence from standing. But Elena kept talking, which was worse. "You know what Adrian's family is like. They've built this whole narrative around both families coming together in a certain way. They assume things. Vivian assumes things. The guests assume things. If people start asking questions right before the ceremony—" "Questions about what?" Margaret asked quietly. "About whether the woman who paid for most of this is also the woman who raised the bride?" Elena flinched. "Please don't make it harsher than it is." Margaret let out a breath that did not feel like breathing at all. "I'm not making it harsher, Elena. I'm only removing the ribbons from it." Her daughter's eyes filled, though whether with guilt or frustration, Margaret could not tell. "I'm asking for one day, just one day where no one starts analyzing where I came from, what my father did, why my mother had jobs people judge, why things weren't—" "Respectable?" Margaret supplied. "That's not what I mean." Margaret looked at her then, at the flawless dress, the careful makeup, the pearl pins, the face she had kissed through fevers and school tears and late-night exam panic. She looked at the daughter for whom she had sold her wedding ring, and suddenly the room felt colder than any winter kitchen she had ever stood in. "What do you want me to be then?" she asked. Elena's answer came too quickly, proof she had rehearsed it in her mind. "Just one of the guests, a family friend, someone important to me, obviously, but not labeled." Not labeled. Margaret almost laughed at the cruelty of modern language, as if motherhood was a tag on a garment that could simply be tucked out of sight for a better presentation. There was a knock at the door before she could respond. One of the bridesmaids pushed it open an inch. "Elena, they need you in 10 minutes. Vivian's asking again about the lineup." "We're coming," Elena called, her voice instantly bright. The door shut. Margaret looked down at the velvet box, then set it carefully on the nearby dressing table. "That was your grandmother's brooch. I thought it might matter." Elena's expression faltered. "Mum!" "No, it's all right." Margaret stepped back. "You should focus on your day."
There were moments in life when people expect a scene and are unsettled instead by stillness. Margaret did not shout. She did not slap her daughter, did not call her ungrateful, did not drag years of sacrifice into the room like broken furniture. She simply felt something inside herself, something old and devoted and unquestioning, go silent. When she left the dressing room, she closed the door with extraordinary gentleness. Outside, the estate seemed drenched in beauty. White roses climbed iron arches. Staff moved briskly across manicured lawns. Guests in tailored coats and pastel dresses drifted toward the stone chapel where the ceremony would take place. A quartet tuned their instruments beneath a canvas awning. Everything had been arranged so carefully that the day looked as though it had sprung fully formed from money rather than exhaustion. Margaret stood alone under the portico and let the wind touch her face. June, who had come as her guest and one of the few people from the old town Elena had allowed onto the list, found her there a few minutes later. "You look pale," June said. "Has something happened?" Margaret turned toward her old friend. June's expression changed immediately. What did she say? It astonished Margaret that after all these years, June could still read her faster than anyone else. Margaret kept her voice even. "She asked me not to tell people I'm her mother." June's mouth fell open. "She what?" "Quietly," Margaret said, "in a very lovely room." June swore under her breath. "Margaret, no, no." Margaret looked out across the lawn. "Apparently, I'm to be an important but unlabeled presence." June's face sharpened with outrage. "Then let me march in there and label a few things for her." For the first time since leaving the dressing room, Margaret almost smiled. "No, you cannot let her do this." "I'm not letting her," Margaret replied. "I'm seeing her clearly." That shut June up for a moment. The chapel bells began to ring, soft and formal. Guests were being guided inside now, ushers smiling with the solemn efficiency of people who thought weddings existed mainly to prove that seating plans were a form of civilization. June touched Margaret's arm. "You don't have to stay." Margaret considered that. She truly did. There was a car service booked for later. There was still time to leave before anyone noticed. She imagined herself walking away from the estate, getting into the nearest taxi, disappearing back to the rented flat above the pharmacy, with her dignity bruised but intact. But another thought came with it, steadier and sadder. If she left now, Elena would always be able to tell herself that her mother had ruined the day by making it about hurt feelings. If she stayed, silent and composed, then whatever collapsed later would belong to truth alone. So Margaret lifted her chin. "I paid for the flowers," she said. "I'd rather see them in place." June stared at her with a mixture of admiration and grief. "You always were made of sterner stuff than the rest of us." "No, I was just trained by necessity." They entered the chapel without further comment. Margaret was not seated in the first row. That honor had been quietly absorbed into the Whitmore family arrangement, where Vivian sat like a queen of polished sorrow beside her husband Charles and two elderly relatives with old surnames and impeccable posture. Margaret had been placed 3 rows back, beside June and behind a cluster of Adrian's cousins who smelled of expensive cologne and spoke in low voices about ski houses and market uncertainty. One woman turned halfway around before the ceremony began and smiled politely. "Are you from Elena's side or Adrian's?" she asked. Margaret met her gaze. "I've known the bride all her life." The woman laughed lightly, not catching the weight beneath the words. "How lovely." When the music began, all conversation ceased. Adrian stood at the front of the chapel, looking unexpectedly vulnerable despite the confidence of his tailoring. Margaret watched him carefully. He seemed sincere in his happiness, and that hurt too, because it meant he had not orchestrated this ugliness. He did not know what Elena had asked of her. At least, Margaret hoped he did not. Then Elena appeared at the chapel entrance on the arm of Charles Whitmore. Not alone, not with her mother, with her future father-in-law, in a symbolic gesture Vivian had apparently deemed elegant and unproblematic. A murmur of admiration moved through the guests. Elena was radiant. There was no other word for it. Her veil drifted behind her like mist, and the morning light through the stained glass touched the beading on her dress until she seemed to glow from within. Margaret's throat tightened. How many mothers had lived for this image? How many had sewn, scrubbed, endured, borrowed, starved, and prayed for the sight of a daughter walking toward a life that promised more ease than their own? She had wanted that for Elena more than she had ever wanted fairness for herself. And yet, as Elena passed her row without looking directly at her, Margaret understood something that would have frightened her once. Love could survive disappointment, but respect, once deliberately broken, did not simply grow back because the music was beautiful. The ceremony itself was graceful and almost painfully sincere. Adrian's voice shook slightly when he said his vows. Elena cried at the proper moment. Guests dabbed their eyes. The priest spoke about devotion, truth, and the joining not only of 2 people, but of 2 families. At that, Margaret nearly bowed her head with bitter amusement. Truth. What a word to use in a room built on omission. After the ceremony, guests spilled onto the lawn in a shower of petals and camera flashes. There were congratulations, laughter, the pop of champagne corks, the ceremonial easing that came once everyone could stop pretending they were not waiting for food. Margaret moved through it all quietly, offering a small smile here, a nod there, never inviting conversation and never refusing it. She had become, just as Elena requested, strangely unclassifiable. But if something inside her had broken, something else had begun to form in its place. Distance. Not coldness, not vengeance, not the theatrical fury novels liked to reward. Something more useful than that. A widening space between what Elena chose to be and what Margaret was willing to keep excusing. At the reception hall, this new clarity sharpened. The room was breathtaking. Long tables draped in ivory linen gleamed under chandeliers. Gold-edged place cards caught the light. The floral installations rose like living sculpture from the centerpieces and alcoves. White garden roses, late-season peonies, orchids imported at ridiculous cost, trailing greenery softening every edge. Margaret knew exactly how much half of it had cost because her signature sat at the bottom of the invoices. Guests were seated, speeches began. The father of the groom welcomed everyone with practiced warmth. Vivian spoke elegantly about continuity, values, and the beauty of family. More than once, Margaret heard phrases like coming together and shared legacy, and each one landed on her like a small stone. Then came the first hint that the perfection of the day had cracks in it. Near the service entrance, partly concealed by a velvet divider, voices were rising. low at first, then urgent. Margaret turned slightly in her chair. A venue manager in a dark suit was speaking in tense whispers to the wedding planner. Another man, one of the catering coordinators by the look of him, held a folder in his hand and looked distinctly uncelebratory. June, seated beside Margaret, murmured, "That doesn't look festive." "No," Margaret said quietly, "it doesn't." Across the room, Adrian noticed it too. He leaned toward one of the staff, frowned, then excused himself with the polite confidence of a groom accustomed to smoothing over details. Elena saw him go and stiffened almost imperceptibly. Margaret caught that expression. Not surprise, recognition. Whatever was happening, Elena had feared it might. And as Adrian crossed the room toward the cluster of anxious staff, Margaret sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and felt the illusion around the day begin to thin. Adrian did not raise his voice at first. That was what made the moment feel so dangerous. He stood beside the service entrance, with one hand still loosely holding his champagne glass, listening to the venue manager explain something in low, clipped tones, while the wedding planner shuffled papers with the brittle efficiency of someone who had spent a career making disasters look decorative. Across the hall, laughter continued at a few tables where guests had not yet noticed the shift. A violinist near the far wall adjusted his music stand. Cutlery clinked against china, but in the center of that glowing room, a different kind of atmosphere was taking shape, one made not of celebration, but of strain. Margaret couldn't hear every word. She didn't need to. She knew the figures, the schedules, the unpaid balances, the way problems multiplied when wealthy people assumed someone else had already handled the unpleasant parts. She had signed too many contracts not to recognize the look on the venue manager's face. Adrian set down his glass. "I'm sorry," he said, clearly trying to remain composed. "Can you explain that again?" The manager glanced at the planner before replying. "There are outstanding payments on the venue extension, the additional floral installations, and part of the catering upgrade. We were assured final settlement had already been arranged." The planner cut in quickly. "It was arranged, or rather, we believed it was. There seems to have been some confusion about which side was completing what." Adrian's brow tightened. "Which side?" The planner hesitated. By then, enough of the nearby guests had gone quiet to let the tensions spread. Conversations thinned, then stopped altogether in pockets. Elena was standing now, one hand pressed too tightly around the stem of her champagne flute. "Adrian," she said lightly, too lightly, "it can wait. Please, let's not do admin in the middle of dinner." He looked at her, then back at the manager. "No, I'd like to understand why vendors are approaching us during the reception." The catering coordinator stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Sir, we only did because our team was told the remaining balance would be released this afternoon. We have staff on site, overnight breakdown arrangements, and transport already scheduled." From the head table, Vivian Whitmore rose with a graceful frown that did nothing to hide her alarm. "What on earth is going on?" she asked. Charles remained seated, but looked as if his collar had suddenly become too tight. No one answered quickly enough, and that silence was fatal. Then one of the floral assistants, young, tired, and unaware of the social architecture collapsing around her, said the wrong thing in the honest tone of someone who assumed it was already public knowledge. "I thought Mrs. Bell was handling most of it." The room shifted, not loudly, not theatrically, but unmistakably. Adrian turned. "Mrs. Bell?" The assistant, realizing too late that she had stepped into something far above her pay grade, pointed with hesitant politeness toward Margaret's table. "There," she said. "She signed the design revisions, the arch installation, most of the deposit confirmations. We were told she'd finalize the rest once the transferred funds cleared." Every head that mattered seemed to turn at once. Margaret did not move. June beside her muttered under her breath, "Well, there it is." Elena had gone completely still. The color had drained from her face so swiftly it seemed almost unreal against the careful cosmetics. Adrian looked at Margaret, then at Elena, then back again, and the comprehension that crossed his face was not merely about money. It was about omission, about posture, about the hidden architecture of the entire day. He walked toward Margaret slowly, like a man approaching a truth he did not want but could no longer avoid. When he reached her table, his voice was quiet enough that not everyone could hear, though enough people did. "Is that true?" he asked. "Did you pay for all this?" Margaret looked up at him. In another life, with different choices behind them, this could have been a private conversation, a sad one perhaps, but still private. That possibility had already been destroyed. "I paid for most of it," she said calmly. "The venue deposits, the floral design, the upgraded menu, the quartet, the coach transport, and some of the accommodation blocks. There are still balances outstanding because several things increased after the original figures." Adrian's expression sharpened. "Why was I not told?" Margaret almost answered, "Because my daughter asked me not to be anything inconvenient," but she did not say that, not yet. Instead, she replied, "That may be a better question for Elena." Across the room, Elena took 2 steps forward. "Adrian, please." He turned to her with a look Margaret had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not exactly, something wounded and searching. "You told me your side had everything covered through family arrangements," he said. "You let me believe the invoices were being handled jointly." Elena's voice wavered. "They were being handled by your mother," he said, and there was no missing the word now. It landed in the room like glass breaking. Vivian closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself against a headache. Charles stared at the tablecloth. Elena swallowed hard. "I was going to sort it after." "After what?" Adrian asked. "After the wedding? After people found out on their own? After your mother remained invisible long enough for this to feel convenient?" A murmur ran through the guests, but Margaret no longer cared what any of them thought. That was the strangest part. The humiliation she had expected to consume her seemed to have burned through so completely that it had left behind a kind of clean emptiness. June placed a hand over Margaret's for one brief second, then let go. Vivian approached next, every inch controlled, even now. "Margaret," she said, and for the first time the name sounded uncertain in her mouth. "I was not aware of the extent of your contributions." "No," Margaret replied, "you weren't." It was not rude, it was simply true. Vivian's chin lifted a fraction. This should have been handled with more transparency. Margaret met her gaze. Yes, it should have. Elena stood between them all, trapped at last not by class nor by image, but by the sum of her own choices. Her eyes shone with tears, but Margaret noticed something with painful clarity. The tears came not only from remorse, some of them came from the horror of public collapse, from the failure of the polished story she had worked so hard to maintain. "Mum," Elena said, her voice breaking, "I never meant for it to happen like this." Margaret rose from her chair. The room seemed to lean toward her. She felt it, the expectation, the appetite for drama, the silent hope that she would either forgive everything beautifully or expose everything brutally. Audiences loved both versions. Real life rarely offered either. She smoothed the front of her dress. "No," she said, "you meant for it to happen more quietly." Elena closed her eyes. Adrian stepped back a little, as if giving space not from etiquette, but from shame. Shame for what he had not known, perhaps. shame for the role his world had played in what Elena became around it. Margaret looked at him. "You asked who paid for everything." He nodded once. "I did what mothers do, or what some of us do. I made sure my daughter had what she wanted, even when it cost more than I should have given. That part is mine. What she chose to do with that gift is hers." The silence after that felt vast. Then, because she saw no reason to remain trapped inside the wreckage any longer, Margaret reached for her handbag. June stood instantly. "I'm coming with you." "Mum, please don't go," Elena said, and this time there was something closer to genuine panic in her voice. "Please, not like this." Margaret turned toward her daughter. The sight before her was almost unbearable. The same child she had once held through fever, now dressed in silk and crystal and desperation, asking not to be abandoned, but having already done the abandoning first. Love still lived in Margaret. That was the tragedy. It simply no longer ruled her. "I'm not leaving to punish you," she said quietly. "I'm leaving because I don't belong in a room where I had to be hidden to be tolerated." Elena let out a small, broken sound. Adrian spoke then, though not to stop her. "Mrs. Bell, Margaret, I am sorry." She believed that he was, but belief was not enough to repair what had been revealed. "The marriage is yours to protect now," she said to him, "but my dignity is mine." Then she walked away. No one physically tried to stop her. That would have required courage none of them possessed in that moment. The guests parted without meaning to, as though some old instinct still understood the solemnity of a woman leaving after being wronged. June followed close behind, one hand hovering near Margaret's back without touching her. They crossed the reception hall, the foyer, the flower-lined portico, and finally the front steps of the estate. Outside, the evening air had cooled. The sky was turning the soft gray blue of an English dusk, and somewhere beyond the hedges a rook called from a tree. The world, indifferent as always, went on being beautiful. Only when they reached the gravel drive did June say, "I'll murder them all if you like." Margaret laughed then, not because it was funny, but because grief and humiliation had twisted so tightly inside her that laughter was the only thing that came out. "You'd pull something trying," June said. "You are impossible." "No," Margaret answered, "just very tired." A car was summoned. They rode back in near silence, the kind only old friends can share without making it feel empty. Streetlights began to appear as they neared the village. Shop fronts passed in a blur. Margaret kept her eyes on the window and watched her own reflection flicker faintly over the glass. When they reached the flat above the pharmacy, June insisted on coming up. "You need tea," June said. "I need a decade. You can have tea tonight and a decade later." Inside, the flat was small but clean, with folded linens on a chair and unopened mail on the sideboard. Margaret took off her shoes and placed her handbag on the table. For a moment, she simply stood in the center of the room, listening to the quiet. Then she did something June did not expect. She walked to the filing drawer by the bookcase and pulled out a stack of folders. June stared. "What are you doing?" Margaret set the folders on the table. Contracts, account summaries, invoices, lease documents, loan papers. The paperweight of years. "I am finding out exactly what my life costs," she said. "Tonight?" "Yes, tonight." June's expression softened. "Margaret?" She looked up. "If I wait until tomorrow, I'll cry all morning and think all afternoon and lose another day to grief. I have already given enough days away." So they sat together at the table until nearly midnight. Margaret added figures, crossed out assumptions, circled obligations, and made notes in the margins. She calculated what remained in her accounts, what Bell & Bloom was truly earning, what the loan business would require over the next 18 months, how much the rented flat cost compared with the cottage she had sold. It was brutal, clarifying work, the kind that stripped pain of its theatricality and turned it into practical choices. By the time June fell asleep in the armchair with a blanket over her knees, Margaret had made 3 decisions. First, she would not answer Elena's calls immediately, no matter how many came. An apology offered in panic was not the same as repentance. Second, she would stop organizing her life around the possibility of being needed by someone who only wanted her in private. And third, Bell & Bloom would no longer remain small out of caution. The next morning, she woke after only a few hours of sleep and went straight to the shop. The arbor air was sharp, the street still half empty. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and inhaled the familiar mingling scent of greenery, damp stems, and old wood. For the first time in many months, perhaps years, the shop did not feel like an extension of sacrifice. It felt like something that was still hers. Her assistant, Nora, arrived 20 minutes later and stopped when she saw Margaret already at the counter, sleeves rolled up, sorting invoices. "I thought you were at the wedding," Nora said. "I was." Nora blinked. "And?" Margaret looked at the buckets waiting to be cleaned, the orders pinned to the board, the cooler humming softly in the corner. "And now I'm here." There was enough in her tone that Nora asked no more. That week, Margaret called the manager of Beaumont House and proposed a long-term seasonal floral contract instead of the piecemeal arrangement they had used before. She contacted a regional events coordinator who had once praised her memorial work and asked for a meeting. She reviewed every unprofitable service Bell & Bloom offered and cut 2 of them entirely. She inquired about a larger workshop space behind an old bakery. She even allowed herself, for the first time in decades, to imagine expanding under her own ambition, rather than stretching under someone else's need. Elena called 9 times in 3 days. Margaret let the phone ring. On the 4th day, Adrian called once. She did not answer that either. It was not cruelty, it was recovery. At closing on Friday, Margaret stood outside the shop and looked at the new chalkboard sign Nora had written that morning in looping white letters. Bell & Bloom, arrangements for every turning of life. Margaret read it twice. Every turning of life. Yes, she thought, this too. The wedding had taken something from her, and she did not yet know whether her relationship with her daughter would survive in any healthy form. But it had also done something else, something she would only later learn to name properly. It had ended her willingness to disappear. And once that ended, an entirely different life became possible. The first winter after the wedding passed in hard, clean lines. Margaret worked through it the way she had survived every difficult season of her life, not dramatically, but steadily. She woke before dawn, boiled the kettle, reviewed orders with her glasses low on her nose, and walked to Bell & Bloom while the streets were still gray and empty. The cold that year seemed to settle deep into the stones of the village, but it did not reach her in the same way it once had. Something in her had changed too much for that. She was no longer enduring hardship for someone else's future. She was building one of her own. And because of that, the work began to bear different fruit. The new contract with Beaumont House became 3 contracts by spring. A memorial service she designed for a retired judge's family led to referrals among people who cared less about pedigree than discretion and excellence. The larger workshop space behind the old bakery became available sooner than expected, and Margaret took it with a boldness that would once have frightened her. Nora, who had only ever known her employer as disciplined and gentle, stared when Margaret signed the lease without asking for an extra week to think. "You're really doing it," Nora said.
Margaret tucked the pen into her handbag. Yes. Nora smiled. Good. The expansion changed the rhythm of the business. There was room now for drying racks, design tables, storage shelving, and bigger commissions. Margaret hired a second assistant, a quiet young woman named Tessa who had recently aged out of foster care and was trying to keep her footing while studying part-time. Tessa arrived for her first shift in an oversized coat and apologized 3 times in 10 minutes for not knowing enough. Margaret handed her a bundle of greenery and said, "If you can learn to handle stems gently and people honestly, the rest comes." Tessa blinked. That's it? For flowers and for life, mostly yes. The girl laughed then, uncertain but warmed by the answer. It was in these months that Margaret discovered something she had long denied herself: ease. Not leisure exactly, she was too practical, too shaped by years of labor for that word to come naturally, but ease in her own skin. She no longer jumped when the phone rang. She no longer organized every week around the possibility that Elena might need money, reassurance, or rescue. She still thought of her daughter every day. There are losses one continues to carry even after they stop actively bleeding. But the thinking was different now, less frantic, less enslaved. Elena, for her part, did not disappear. At first, the attempts at contact came in waves: late-night voicemails, long text messages, one bouquet delivered anonymously and returned unopened because Margaret recognized Adrian's driver at the door. Then the messages changed in tone. They became shorter, less pleading, more honest. "I know you don't owe me a reply. I am not writing to ask for quick forgiveness. I am starting therapy. Adrian knows everything now. I am trying to understand why I became someone who could do that to you." Margaret read each message only once. Then she set the phone aside. It was Adrian, unexpectedly, who became the clearer voice in the distance. He sent one letter by post 6 months after the wedding. Not an email, not a text. A letter, written in his careful hand on plain cream stationery. Margaret opened it standing at the kitchen counter. He did not defend himself. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply wrote that he had failed by not asking harder questions, that he had allowed the assumptions of his world to do harm because they had once seemed so normal to him he barely saw them. He wrote that he had insisted Elena repay every wedding-related expense in full, not as punishment, but because dignity should never remain written as debt. And he wrote one sentence that made Margaret put the letter down and close her eyes for a moment. "You were treated as if your love were a convenience. I want you to know at least one person in that room understood too late that it was the most honorable thing present." Margaret did not reply to that letter either, but she kept it. By the following summer, Bell and Bloom had become more than a surviving little shop. It had become a name. Margaret's work appeared in a regional magazine spread about understated English event design. A hotel in Bath contracted her for a seasonal installation. A charity committee asked if she would oversee floral styling for their autumn gala, an event known for drawing donors, press, and every person within driving distance who liked to be photographed beside beautiful things while claiming to support noble causes. When Nora read the invitation aloud, she nearly shouted. "The Whitmore Foundation is sponsoring it," she said. Margaret, trimming roses at the work table, did not immediately look up. "I heard." Nora blinked. "You still said yes?" Margaret clipped another stem and placed it in water. "If they asked for my work, not my autobiography." That was true, but it was not the only reason she accepted. Some part of her, the part that had finally learned not to hide from discomfort, wanted to walk into a room connected to that family and do so entirely as herself. Not the erased mother, not the tolerated guest, not the woman in the background footing the bill. Herself. The gala took place in early October, nearly 2 years after the wedding. The venue was a restored manor outside London, all honey-colored stone and long windows reflecting the darkening sky. Margaret and her team arrived before sunrise to install the designs. She had chosen a restrained palette: ivory roses, smoke-toned lisianthus, dark foliage, soft berries, candlelight woven through texture rather than excess. It was elegant without begging for approval, mature, certain. As she stood on a ladder adjusting trailing greenery above the entry arch, Tessa stepped back and said quietly, "It looks expensive."
Margaret smiled. That's because restraint costs more than chaos. By late afternoon, the room was transformed. Tables glowed. The staircase arrangement fell like a river of dim silver and cream. Staff moved carefully through the beauties she had made. Several committee members arrived early and praised the work with the kind of delight that comes when people realize they are in the presence of craftsmanship rather than trend. One of them, a woman in a sapphire coat, touched the edge of a centerpiece and said, "This may be the most elegant room we've had in years. Are you Margaret Bell?" "Yes." The woman smiled warmly. "I've heard your name often lately. Now I understand why." That simple sentence pleased Margaret more than flattery once would have, because it carried no condescension. It was recognition, clean and direct. She was reviewing the final candle placements when she sensed someone behind her and turned. Elena stood at the base of the staircase. For a second, Margaret did not fully recognize her, not because her daughter looked like a stranger, but because she looked so much more like herself than she had at the wedding. The polish remained. Elena had always been beautiful, but something defensive had softened. She wore a simple dark green dress, her hair swept back without theatrical effort, and there was no performance in the way she held her body, no attempt to appear untouched. She looked, Margaret thought with a strange ache, like a woman who had lived through consequences. "Mum," Elena said. Margaret set down the list in her hand. "Hello, Elena." There was a pause, the kind that holds years inside it. "You look well," Elena said quietly. "So do you." That took work. Margaret believed that too. Guests had not fully arrived yet. Staff crossed the far end of the hall carrying trays, but the staircase landing where they stood felt private enough for truth. Elena came one step closer and stopped, as though she understood she no longer had the right to close distances without invitation. "I asked one of the coordinators whether I could speak with you before the evening began," she said. "Only if I promised not to disrupt the woman holding the entire event together." Margaret almost smiled. A wise coordinator. Elena's mouth trembled faintly. "I don't have a speech prepared." "Good." "I wrote several over the past year," Elena admitted. "All of them sounded like I was still trying to manage how I appeared." Margaret folded her hands loosely in front of her. "And now?" "Now I am trying not to do that." Outside, a car door shut. More guests were arriving. Elena drew a careful breath. "What I did to you was cruel. Not only at the wedding, long before that. The wedding was just the first time I couldn't hide it with good manners and timing." Margaret said nothing. She wanted the apology, if there was one, to stand on its own legs. Elena continued. "Therapy did not make me a better person overnight. Adrian didn't either. You not answering me didn't either. But all of it forced me to sit still with who I had become. I hated what I saw, not because I got caught, because it was real." Margaret looked at her daughter's face, the same face she had kissed through childhood, now stripped of glamour by sincerity. "Are you still with Adrian?" she asked. Elena blinked, perhaps surprised by the question. "Yes." "Why?" A sad smile touched Elena's mouth. "Because he was angrier about the way I treated you than about the embarrassment to his family. Because he would not let me turn it into a class argument when it was a character argument. because he stayed, but not cheaply.